Good morning, class. Today we're going to start our lesson on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. To this point, you've gone through a few lessons on the three economic indicators: GDP, output, employment and unemployment, and CPI/inflation. And last lesson, we had a time to look at donut economics, which is a critique on the regular assessment of the economy using things like GDP and the circular flow of income, which we will encounter a few lessons from now. But so as we begin today's lessons, as usual, we'll go through the homework a little bit. Make sure you take a look at what's here to see if you've done your homework correctly. And of course, again, if you have any questions or concerns about your homework, please send me ADSB messages and I'll try to address them either directly or on the next video. So today, as we explore aggregate supply and demand, we want to figure out how to build an aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, be able to evaluate the equilibrium point of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, and relate them to the economic indicators, as well as understand how changes in aggregate supply and aggregate demand will happen and what those changes mean to an economy. To see success in this lesson, you're going to want to be able to do aggregate supply and aggregate demand, constructing them and modifying them, as well as doing the homework and the review. So we're going to start with the easier of the two, aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total demand for all goods and services in a society. And this is in contrast to what regular demand is, or the microeconomic demand is that we've been talking about up until this unit. And so you will have thought about demand in terms of demand for a singular good, demand for a chocolate bar, demand for schooling, demand for healthcare, demand for laborers, whatever it may be. And so when you want to add the word aggregate, or aggregate means all, total, everything, you're looking at the demand for everything because that's what aggregate means. So it's the total demand for all goods and services in a society. So it's not specific to any single thing. It's the entire demand for what our country wants. And so a good distinction to look at that is to understand that aggregate demand actually is GDP. How do I make this connection? GDP, what is it? GDP is consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, exports minus imports. And so ultimately, GDP is all the spending that's happening, right? The expenditure approach of GDP is to count everything that was purchased or everything that was bought at any given price level. And that's effectively what aggregate demand is, right? The demand for everything, right? Given a certain price level, given a certain time frame, right? So aggregate demand and GDP are equivalent given certain types of restrictions. And so what do we think aggregate demand looks like? Aggregate demand will look like just regular demand. And so you'll want to look at our new axes and our new model as we start to construct it. You'll see that output is on the x-axis, and that is y. And that is to replace quantity from a microeconomic graph. And the y-axis is CPI or price, and that's similar to our microeconomic graph being price. And so as we look at aggregate demand, we want to label it AD. Labeling it just regular demand as D would be incorrect. And so we want to make sure that we get into the habit of labeling it correctly. The x-axis can be labeled output or y, and the y-axis can be labeled price again, if you'd like. So if you analyze this graph like you would analyze any macroeconomic graph, you'll see that at higher levels of prices, output will be lower. Theoretically, again, we have to see how the economy is growing and how it's working to really figure out what's happening. And you can't look at aggregate demand in isolation necessarily. But the graph is downward sloping. It's similar in how it reacts and behaves as microeconomic demand. And so now we're going to look at aggregate supply. We'll take a look here. Aggregate demand behaves just as regular demand behaves. The same law of demand applies, downward sloping, which I just mentioned. So if we want to look at supply or aggregate supply, it is total supply for all goods and services produced in a society. Again, similarly, aggregate meaning all, everything, the total amount versus regular supply or microeconomic supply being the supply of a singular good. So we want to look at this graph. And so this graph is going to be significantly different and significantly harder to get right away than the aggregate demand to regular demand kind of thought process. And so this is what aggregate supply looks like. And this is a heavy departure from our regular supply. It still behaves in the same way. It's still upward sloping, but it has a somewhat different shape, as you can obviously notice. You can see that it is flat. It is flat at the earlier stages, and it's more vertical at the latter stages. So the next thing we need to look at is, why does it behave like this? And so we need to examine the aspects of this curve and understand, why does it look flatter at one part and why does it look more vertical at the next part. And so what we want to do right now is to refresh our memory of elasticity. So I'm going to toggle over to an elasticity graph from our Unit 2 lessons right now. So the first review we're going to do here is inelastic supply. And so if we look at an inelastic supply curve, it's going to be vertical. And so you see here, the red line is an inelastic supply. And this supply line indicates a low percentage change in quantity versus a larger percentage change in price. So if demand changed and prices increased quite a bit, the quantity change would be fairly low. And if you look at a elastic supply curve, it's going to be much flatter or more horizontal, whereas in this situation, an increase in price, a small increase in price, is leading to a much larger increase in quantity supplied. And so you have to make sure you understand that a flat curve is elastic, while a more vertical curve is more inelastic. And so that's our small little tutorial again on elasticity, while we go back to our previous graph. So now we're back at the aggregate supply graph. And so with that previous very, very quick tutorial on elasticity, we see that aggregate supply at the lower level looks very elastic, and at the higher level looks very inelastic. And it's important to be able to recognize these two shapes, right? So hopefully you can notice that these shapes have happened. But I guess the more important thing is to understand, why does this shape occur? And so in the elastic scenario, output is low. And so you can notice that when we're very early on in the curve, output, or y, is at the very early stages of the x-axis, so output is very, very low. And so if this is the case and output's low, that typically means that there are very many idle resources, whether that be unemployment, whether that be resources just not being used. Things just aren't there. Like, if our output is low, people aren't working. Our economy is actually slower. Our economy is slowing down, and things aren't producing as much. And so if that's the case, and our economy is very, very slow, and we have idle resources just kind of sitting there in wait for the next uptick, then if companies, businesses, governments want to start producing more, if they want to start moving and increasing output, prices don't actually need to increase, right? If I want to hire more workers, there are people who are unemployed, so it's very easy to access those resources. If I need to access other types of resources, like natural resources and whatnot, there's many things that are idle, so I don't need to pay through the nose to get more items, right? And so as output increases or shifts or moves to the right on the x-axis, we're looking at very, very minuscule, minor increases in price, right? Wages aren't going up. Prices of resources aren't going up, right? Up until a point where we get to a full employment of resources. And so you're going to see and notice near the middle of the curve, it just starts to increase much quicker. And so at that point, maybe more people have jobs. Maybe there are more resources that are being used. And so it's becoming more and more scarce, right? And so as that happens, it's harder to get resources for you to increase your output, right? It's hard to acquire land. It's harder to get people to do jobs. And so if that's the case, for you to want to increase your output or continue along that x-axis and increase that output, you need to pay more money, right? If I want to poach an employee from a different company, I might have to pay them more money to come to my company to work. If I want to get that oil reserve or that amount of stuff, I need to pay more for that. And so ultimately, as employment increases, as resources get used, scarcity starts to rear its ugly head again, right? And so as scarcity happens more, our pursuit to produce more output is going to drive prices way, way, way up, which is, you can see why in the elasticity portion, or in the inelastic portion, prices start to increase very, very rapidly with very, very minimal increases in output, up to a point where a max capacity is reached. And so this maximum capacity line, the green line, that is indicator of when we cannot surpass that. That is a limit. That is a depiction of where the PPF would be in the production possibilities curve, right? And so every economy has that green line, and that inelastic curve is going to ultimately approach that green line, and very rarely will ever hit that green line, but it cannot go beyond that green line. And so that's the reasoning why at the bottom of the curve it's elastic, while at the top of the curve it is inelastic. And so there's something else that I want you to notice here. So you should notice that what do we want, right? We want prices to be low, or at least relatively stable, but we also want full employment, right? So these are both economic goals. So full employment is an economic goal, or high employment. Stable prices are also an economic goal. And so if you remember back to our previous units, those are actually conflicting goals. And you'll see that there's a trade-off, right? For me to want to get full employment of resources, full employment of people, I'm going to have to sacrifice price stability. I'm going to have to sacrifice inflation. Inflation is going to happen if I end up getting full employment of resources. So it's important to understand that while we want both things, we can't have both things all the time. And so ultimately your government, your economic advisors are going to have to choose to sacrifice something sometimes if they need to. And so ultimately, where do we want to be, right? And so we want to be at a point where aggregate supply and aggregate demand are at equilibrium. And so what point is that? Just like macroeconomic supply and demand, there is an equilibrium point. And in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, we're talking about an optimal point of equilibrium, right? And so if you look at this point where aggregate demand intersects aggregate supply, you're going to see that they intersect roughly where aggregate supply starts to start increasing in price very quickly, right? So you'll have a price at equilibrium and you'll have an output at equilibrium, and that FE means full employment, right? And so at this point, we theoretically reach full employment, right? We want to get to that point, we're at full employment, but we don't necessarily want to go beyond that point, because going beyond that point is going to cause prices to rapidly rise. And so it's a government's goal, effectively, to try to stay in that little zone where we have good employment levels, our output's very high, yet prices are still relatively stable. And so in this situation, what do our three economic indicators say? Output is high, employment is also high, and inflation is low, or price stability is high, right? So this is why we want to introduce our economic indicators first. We want to see, how do we evaluate the economy? What are the three main things that people use to evaluate how an economy is doing? And so with a good understanding of these three indicators, we can see why an economy wants to be at full employment equilibrium of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In the bottom situation, where we have aggregate demand 1, you see a situation where our output is very low. And so in this situation, output would be low, employment will also be low, and inflation would be low. And so two of the three things are not good. Output's low and employment's low, but inflation is also low, so that's the one good thing. And so if we're in this situation, it's called the recessionary gap. And it's in all likelihood we are in that, or we're entering that, or have entered that situation currently with our economic climate. The other scenario would be the aggregate demand 2, where our prices are very high and our output is very high. And so in this situation, prices are high, output's high, and employment is high. Two of the three are good, but prices in this situation are way, way too high. Inflation has gone through the roof. And in this scenario, that's what we call inflationary gap. So ultimately, we want to be in a scenario where we do not want to be in 82, and we also do not want to be in 81. We want to get back to aggregate demand at full employment. And so just to review, a recessionary gap situation has increased unemployment, decreased inflation, and decreased GDP growth, while an inflationary gap situation has increased employment, increased inflation, and increased GDP growth. And so you can do that homework later. We want to get to a point where how are we going to effectively get aggregate demand where we want it to be? And often this is what politicians, economists are always striving to do. They want to figure out, how do I make our economy stronger? How do we do these types of things? Sometimes it's because they know it's the best thing to do. Sometimes they want to do it for votes. Whatever the case may be, governments are always trying to manipulate what's happening with aggregate demand. And so how do we end up changing aggregate demand? Previously, we stated that aggregate demand is GDP. And GDP is consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and exports minus imports. And so if we want to change aggregate demand, we just need to try to change GDP. And so the first one, consumption spending. So we want to be able to change consumer spending habits by changing what they do. And so one example is to decrease taxes, right? If you decrease taxes, people's income or disposable income will effectively increase. Consumption will effectively increase. GDP will effectively increase in these scenarios. So, for example, right now, again, people are losing their jobs. Small business owners may be going bankrupt depending on how long this quarantine lasts, right? And so the government is giving money to people, right? And so whatever you believe their motives are, some of these motives are to obviously keep people afloat, right? To keep money in people's pockets where it can be used for good. But there are other situations where people think that these things are used for economic stimulus, right? Putting money in people's pockets so they spend money, so they can afford to spend more. This is going to change consumption habits. And if you increase consumption spending, GDP will go up and aggregate demand will go up. Second one, investment spending, right? Capital investment is typically tied to interest rates, right? And so if we change the interest rates, that impacts how much borrowing can happen, right? So if you increase interest rates, borrowing will go down, less spending will happen, and GDP will end up decreasing. And again, in today's climate, the Bank of Canada has reduced interest rates significantly in the past 2 months, right? We are at historical low interest rates, and so that theoretically, it promotes borrowing, right? And promoting of borrowing is going to mean that you're going to borrow money to spend more money, and then GDP will increase. And so that's how you change investment spending. The third is government spending, and government spending is not really impactful in the same way as government trying to impact consumer or investment spending, because governments can do whatever they want. Governments can spend whatever they want to do, but governments can impact spending by transfer payments, right? Governments can shift money and influence spending habits by putting money into different areas. And so that's how governments may impact spending. Export demand. Export demand is tied to domestic inflation. Okay, so if exports are us selling product to other international places, okay, and so we would sell our product elsewhere, and that foreign money theoretically is used to buy our dollars, which is used to buy our product. And so if our prices go up, right, so if something cost $10 yesterday and today it costs $11, that means it costs 11 Canadian dollars to buy this thing, and therefore that other foreign country or that foreign person has to get 11 Canadian dollars. And so effectively this thing has just become more expensive. And so our inflation is going to impact our export demand. 2, income in other countries, right? If other countries increase in wealth, then your exports are likely to increase, and your GDP is likely to increase. And so a lot of people talk about the United States and how if the United States goes into a recession or depression or whatnot, it's going to impact the global landscape. And this is, I guess, maybe less of a conversation now, but it's been a huge conversation. And a lot of people talked about how, China might want to hurt the United States in terms of financially, and so it's possible there. But China and the United States are so interlinked in terms of what's happening in China and what's happening in the United States. The United States is the consumeristic capital of the world, right? If the United States stops spending their money, not only domestically but internationally, other countries are going to suffer, right? Because the United States buys so much stuff from other places, right? And so we have to understand that other countries' income does impact our exports. And so if other countries are richer, they're going to buy more of our stuff. Third one is the Canadian dollar. If our dollar increases, then our exports become more expensive. And so this is different than inflation, right? Inflation is the price of our good goes from $10 to $11, right? And so then they have to get more of our money to buy our thing. In this situation, our thing still costs $10, but now our $10 costs more for that foreigner to get. And that becomes problematic if they want to buy our stuff. And so that'll be more expensive. And so that's those are the things that impact export demand. So those things all impacted and changed aggregate demand. And so now we're going to look at changes in aggregate supply. And so if we look at aggregate supply, we want to look at the price of what it costs us to make everything effectively, right? So for example, if minimum wage goes up, and it has been going up in the Toronto, Ontario area, and people are complaining about how small businesses couldn't afford to pay their wages, it's because if minimum wage goes up, then it costs people more to pay their workers. And therefore, the cost of their production will go up. And so let's take a look at what does this look like, right? And so if this is aggregate supply and minimum wage increases, how do we think that this is going to shift aggregate supply? So if minimum wage goes up, that means prices will increase. And so that aggregate supply curve, the elastic portion of it, should go up in height because prices on the y-axis should increase, right? So cost of production going up increases the prices of all your goods. However, the capacity to produce stays the same. Right? So our supply curve is decreasing. We're able to produce less with the same amount of money. However, our capacity to produce does not change because even though those people cost more money, they're still able to produce it if you were willing to pay them. And so a price of an input change is going to change the curve, yet the capacity ultimately will not change. So for all levels of output, prices have increased because minimum wage has increased. And this could be minimum wage, it could be cost of capital, it could be cost of anything really, cost of natural resources or the factors of production. Prices have gone up, but capacity is no different, right? So you can see at the top of the aggregate supply curve where it goes inelastic. Those two curves will ultimately end up meeting, and the capacity line, the green line, does not change. So this is an example of how a price of an input will change aggregate supply, but you have to understand that part of it will change and the other part of it will stay the same in terms of the capacity level. The next category is amount of inputs available, right? So if you suddenly find a new reserve of oil, or you have suddenly new access to resources that weren't available before, right? So, or if your country has opened doors to immigration, so there are more individual people in our country now, this changes fundamentally the ability for your country to produce, right? So if you do that, aggregate supply should shift out, and the PPC should also shift out. So your maximum capacity should increase. And so this is also this also has the effect of competition going up. So if more people are there, you're able to drop prices because there are more people competing for jobs. If you find a new reserve of oil, or if you suddenly have more access to resources that you didn't have before, you just have more of it, and so prices can theoretically go down. This is very similar in effect to an efficiency change, because the amount of the inputs available to you affects how much you can produce, right? The same way efficiency can affect how much you can produce, right? Your speed can increase, therefore you can produce more. You invented a new piece of technology, therefore you can produce more. You've become more efficient, and so your capacity will also increase. And so both amount of inputs available and efficiency are ways to increase the curve, right? But not only increase the curve in terms of capacity, but also to lower the prices, right? So if you're more efficient, or there's more competition, prices should drop for all levels of output, and the capacity of your firm or your country, this is aggregate supply, so your country should increase, right? So the country has gotten better at doing certain things, or has more population, or has something else, and so the capacity for the entire country has now gone up, and so they are more productive, or they're more efficient, or whatnot. They can just do more. So this ends our lesson on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And so, again, if there are any questions, which I'm sure there will be, please send me messages again. I will respond to them. Some of them might be easier to have a conversation about over Zoom, or on live chat. So please make sure you do this homework and review the text material, so you are aware of how this works and how these curves are different than your microeconomic curves, because they are fundamentally different and they are much harder to deal with. And so again, the recommendation is to be very comfortable with these, because we are going to be doing a thorough analysis on these curves going forward, just like we did with the microeconomic curves. So lessons 5, 6, and 7 are going to be about manipulating these curves and figuring out how do governments, politicians, economists actually try to change aggregate demand, ultimately to get to a significantly better point in our curve. What's our government going to do after all this is over and our economy's been struggling so much, right? So these are questions we're going to try to answer. But again, this is the foundation that you want to make sure you know, understand aggregate supply, and understand aggregate demand. Thank you.